I wanted to ask about the report, private prison report. You seem to be upset that the government looked into this. It appears from Mr. Toews' comments that they're not going down this road. Why do you think it's bad that they actually examined it?
Well, I guess I'd say two things about this. One, it's not clear what they're examining and what they're not. First, it's on the table, off the table. Maybe it's this model or that model, or maybe some parts will be further privatized. So I'm not sure that we have an assurance from the minister that they're not going down some form of this road to private prisons. And as I said in question period, this was already tried in Ontario under the Harris government. It was a tremendous failure. It cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. So my question is, if we're not considering this, then why are we spending millions of dollars again on studies and preparations that might lead to further privatization?
There seems to be prison expansion. They're talking about expanding somewhere to 2,400 to 2,700 beds, but we don't really have much a roadmap of where that's taking place, how it's taking place. Would you like to see a little more clarity on?
Well, one of our big concerns, they've announced the closure of prisons before they have any plan in place to build those new beds. And so what are they going to do with the people who are already in custody? And we haven't even seen the full impacts of Bill C-10 yet and the mandatory minimum sentences. Those are still coming through the courts. So this is a government that's proceeding quite recklessly in the prisons area.
On another matter, on the Jason Kenney email that went out to various members of the LGBT community in Canada, there's quite a few members of that community now very upset that the minister seemed to have sent an email based on their sexual orientation, and they're wondering how he found out about that. The minister's office is saying they only contacted people who had spoken to them about LGBT issues in the past. What's your take on this?
Well, I think there's a serious privacy question here when the minister is obviously touching on a subject that's very sensitive for many people and connecting up sexual orientation with individual names and addresses. So my question to the minister is, I think we need a full explanation of how he put together that list. I'm not sure that those who are concerned accept the argument that they somehow contacted the minister. My understanding is there are people who received those emails who had never contacted the minister. But we need a clear explanation from the minister on how he constructed that list. And then if we don't get that kind of clear explanation, we'll have to consider some kind of complaint to the Privacy Commissioner.
We've seen issues like this in the past where the government has sent Hanukkah cards and Rosh Hashanah cards to Jewish constituents. Is this along the same lines, or is this different somehow?
Well, I think there's a great deal more concern in the lesbian and gay community about people being outed, or this material, how this material might be used against people who have these very serious privacy concerns. So again, all privacy concerns are equally important, but I think that accounts for the very strong reaction in the LGBT community.
The U.S. administration is very angry at the Canadian government and appears to blame them for leaking a transcript of this video interview with Omar Khadr. What do you make of what's going on there? The government seems to be suggesting they're not the source of it because Mr. Toews, though they won't comment on it, says that he never got a transcript. So what do you make of this? And ought that whole interview be released now, the tape of it?
Well, I guess the first question I'd have is, this is a government where you have trouble getting anything out of them. They go to great lengths keeping things secret, like their report on prisons that they commissioned. So it seems to me very odd then that something which they requested from the U.S. government ends up in the public domain. So I obviously don't know who leaked that. I'm concerned about it. I haven't seen it. I don't know what material's in it. I don't know.
Sealed by court order, so
exactly.
So
having been sealed means there's some privacy concerns perhaps in it, or there are legal concerns in it. I haven't seen it. I don't know the answer to that. But it's a big concern when our allies starts to regard us as unreliable with these kinds of documents.
On the issue of prisons, Mr. Toews already said that parts of prison services like dental, medical, psychiatric services are already privatized. Are you surprised about that, A? And I mean, are you opposed to other sections of services or other services being privatized?
Well, I think that Mr. Toews is mixing two things here. We do have contracts for some professional services in our prisons. Everyone knows about that. But if we're talking about operating parts of that system, which he appears to be doing, so things like food service, things like constructing and operating the facilities, that's a big change to what we've done before, and that's the kind of thing that was a big failure in Ontario and also at the provincial level in New Brunswick in trying to bring the private sector further into the running of prisons. Now, I'm glad to see him saying he does not want to see private supervision of prisoners, but that begs the question of what he does want to see for the private sector inside prisons.
Are you opposed to cleaning or food services being privatized?
Well, we need to know what he's talking about before we can decide if we're opposed to it, and what we've seen today is not a very clear answer about what he's actually suggesting.
Are you mainly opposed to private sector involvement in the custodial function, or?
Well, that's certainly where the greatest problems came up in other jurisdictions. Certainly in Britain and in Australia, we saw a very large rise in violence in prisons. We saw a number of grievances and complaints and human rights violations in prisons spike when there was private supervision of prisoners. So that would be a much more serious and more major concern. But again, what we're asking the Minister today is, he's done a study, tell us what he's looking at. What is he actually considering here?
On the leak of the Khadr video, do you think that there's a political agenda being served there? I mean, you said you find it puzzling that it was leaked, but what about the agenda?
Obviously, without knowing who leaked it, I can't answer that question.
Do you think, based on the McLean story and their viewing of the transcript and their reporting on the transcript, that there's a concern that Khadr maybe shouldn't be accepted back into Canadian prison?
Well, again, we have a process for determining this, and I'd like to see that process be transparent. I'd like to see a decision reached in an expeditious manner.
If there was more privatization in the prison system, what do you think the impact would be for the average Canadian, the average taxpayer?
Well, again, today what I'm asking the Minister to tell us what parts he's talking about. Let's have a full debate and discussion of what things he wants to privatize, and then we can see what the impacts are. But generally, the experience around the world is that trying to privatize the actual operation of prisons has not saved money. It's raised problems with discipline within the prisons. It's raised human rights concerns, and so therefore it's probably not a good road to head down.